The oldest surviving journey into the Sumerian underworld begins with confiscation. Inanna, one of the most powerful figures in Mesopotamian religion, approaches the realm called Kur, the Great Below, and discovers that status means nothing there. A gatekeeper named Neti receives her, questions her, and allows her to continue only under the laws of the place she has entered. There are 7 gates, and at each one, something connected to her identity, rank, or authority is removed. By the time Inanna reaches the deepest chamber, the figure who entered as a queen has been stripped of nearly every visible sign of who she was. This comes from one of the earliest literate cultures of southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates. The same civilization that recorded laws, accounts, temple activity, myths, and royal claims also committed stories about death to clay. Thousands of years later, the emotional effect is strange. A world that vanished left behind instructions and narratives about a place its writers believed every human being would eventually enter. Ancient religious literature can be read symbolically, and the descent of Inanna is commonly interpreted in terms of death, humiliation, transformation, and the surrender of earthly power. Yet the alternative reading explored in this story treats the repeated gates sequence more literally. Under that interpretation, the clothing and ornaments are poetic representations of something deeper, layers of identity being removed from a consciousness moving through death. The idea is speculative, but it creates an unsettling way to look at a text whose underworld already has boundaries, laws, administrators, restricted movement, and a destination known as the land of no return. The Sumerians used the term gidim for the surviving shade or ghost of a dead person. In the theory built around these texts, the gidim is the portion of a human being that continues after the body fails. It does not appear in an open, undefined spiritual landscape. It enters an ordered realm in which passage is controlled by beings already waiting there. The dead may continue in some form, but they do so inside conditions they did not create. A prison needs walls only when the captive understands that escape is possible. A process aimed at identity could work differently. If the person reaching the first gate still remembers a name, a family, a life, and a reason to return, then something recognizable has crossed the boundary. If enough of those attachments are removed before the final gate, consciousness could theoretically remain, while the person attached to it disappears. The danger in this reading is therefore not physical death alone. It is arriving somewhere after death, and gradually losing the ability to remember who arrived. The descent of Inanna has a rhythm that is unusually procedural. A gate opens, something is demanded. Inanna objects, yet the law of the underworld is enforced, and the journey continues. The repetition can be understood as ritual structure, but it is precisely that orderly sequence that attracts alternative researchers. They see a process rather than a single symbolic moment, with each stage reducing what the traveler carries from the world above. Personal identity is already layered during life. A name connects a person to society. Memory gives continuity to experience. Relationships anchor a private history, while the body supplies a face, voice, and physical location in the world. If those layers disappear separately, awareness and identity do not necessarily have to vanish at the same instant. That possibility gives the 7 gates their darker interpretation. Each gate may represent one more stage in the dismantling of the self that existed before death. The phrase "land of no return" becomes especially important here. The ordinary reading is straightforward. Those who enter the realm of the dead do not simply walk back into ordinary human life. No return may describe a threshold after which consciousness can no longer return to its former identity because too much memory has been lost. The location remains the same in the story, but the irreversible event becomes psychological rather than geographical. The surviving Sumerian texts do not provide a modern technical description of reincarnation, a memory erasing device, or a machine that transfers souls from one body to another. That stronger claim belongs to a speculative interpretation of the ancient material. Its appeal comes from the way later traditions also describe death as a sequence in which awareness can be redirected, tested, confused, or drawn back toward embodiment. The The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes post-death states in which consciousness encounters experiences it must recognize correctly. Vedic traditions describe samsara, the recurring cycle of birth and death from which liberation is difficult. Egyptian funerary texts preserve names, declarations, and instructions intended to help the dead navigate what follows. Much later, Gnostic writings describe human beings as possessing a divine element trapped within a material order, governed by powers that obstruct escape. These traditions do not prove one another, and they emerged from different cultures with very different beliefs. Still, their shared emphasis on knowledge creates an eerie comparison with Inanna's gates. Again and again, death is portrayed as a passage during which recognition matters. Forgetting, confusion, attachment, or submission can keep the traveler bound to a cycle, while some form of awareness offers the possibility of release. That is the first point where the Sumerian story begins to resemble a trap rather than a tomb. A second Sumerian concept makes the alternative interpretation even stranger. The texts speak of the me, a difficult term associated with divine powers, decrees, offices, and the principles that organize civilization and cosmic order. In the stories, the me can be possessed, transferred, and controlled. Fixed functions that determine how different parts of existence are supposed to operate. That reading becomes important because death too appears to follow rules. The underworld has a gatekeeper. Entry has conditions. Movement occurs through stages. Certain outcomes seem unavoidable unless a traveler possesses unusual status or knowledge. From a religious perspective, these are features of mythic order. From the speculative perspective, they resemble the architecture of a designed system. This places special emphasis on the idea that humanity's fate was designed, linking that language to the same conceptual world as the me. Taken literally by supporters of the theory, death would then be neither a random biological accident nor a purely divine mystery. It would be one function inside a larger order established for human beings from the beginning. This links that account to the Atrahasis tradition and to the modern ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki, in which the gods are treated as advanced physical beings, and humanity is imagined as a labor force created after an earlier group of workers rebelled. There is no mainstream archaeological or Assyriological consensus that Sumerian texts document extraterrestrial genetic engineering. That claim belongs to modern alternative interpretation. But once the theory assumes that human beings were deliberately designed for labor, the afterlife becomes part of the same thought experiment. A workforce can be replaced physically, but a consciousness that retains every previous life could accumulate experience, resentment, and knowledge. A consciousness returned to a new body without access to those memories begins again with none of that continuity. Under this model, the body dies and the surviving consciousness enters Kur. The gate sequence weakens the identity attached to it until the traveler no longer remembers the life that just ended. Rebirth then restores the consciousness to physical existence while leaving the former personality inaccessible. The theory calls this a soul recycling mechanism. The chilling part is its efficiency. Force would be unnecessary if the captive cannot remember the previous cycle. A worker who recalls centuries of labor could eventually recognize the structure around them. A worker who experiences each birth as a first beginning has no accumulated memory from which to challenge it. The reset becomes more important than the return. Seen through that lens, Neti is no longer an image of evil. He is an administrator. His behavior is frightening precisely because it is routine. He follows a rule that existed before Inanna arrived, removes what must be removed, and opens the next gate. The darkness of the theory comes from the possibility that no one operating the process needs to hate humanity at all. They would only need the system to continue functioning, and that leads directly to the most contradictory figure in the entire theory, Enki. Within Mesopotamian tradition, Enki is associated with wisdom, deep waters, craft, creation, and secret knowledge. This places him at the center of the alternative human engineering story, yet it also emphasizes traditions in which he acts to preserve human life against decisions made elsewhere in the divine hierarchy. The Atrahasis story, for example, contains a divine warning connected to a catastrophic flood. This also gives secrecy a practical purpose. If recognition is the only defense against the cycle, then knowledge of the process becomes dangerous to whoever benefits from the reset. That is how the theory interprets later mystery schools and restricted teachings, as survival knowledge passed selectively from teacher to initiate. There is no direct evidence proving that these schools inherited one continuous Sumerian escape doctrine. Still, the idea fits the pattern the theory is building. The decisive advantage is not strength, wealth, or social rank. It is arriving at the threshold already knowing what the threshold is. That dual role creates a useful tension. If Enki belongs to the order responsible for creating humanity, why does he repeatedly appear as a figure who gives selected humans knowledge that allows them to survive danger imposed by that same order? Alternative researchers use that contradiction to suggest that the ancient mystery traditions may preserve fragments of information given from inside the system rather than discovered from outside it. The comparison reaches beyond Mesopotamia. Gnostic Gnosis emphasizes direct recognition of the divine element within the human being. Tibetan death traditions place immense importance on recognizing states of consciousness as they arise. Egyptian funerary texts preserve passwords, names, declarations, and ritual knowledge for the deceased. The details differ greatly, but each tradition assumes that ignorance after death can be dangerous and that preparation during life can affect what happens during the passage. In the speculative Sumerian model, the purpose of that preparation is brutally specific. A dying person must remain aware while the ordinary structure of identity begins to dissolve. If consciousness identifies completely with memory, status, personality, and bodily existence, then losing those things may feel like losing consciousness itself. The alternative traditions instead preserve the possibility of an observing awareness that remains present beneath those layers. That changes the meaning of Inanna's surrender at the gates. She does not overpower Neti, break the doors, or keep every symbol of authority she carried into the descent. She yields what each gate demands and continues deeper. Eventually, she reaches the place where almost every external definition of Inanna has been removed, yet her story does not conclude with permanent disappearance. And then Inanna returns. For alternative readers, that return is the detail that keeps the entire theory alive. The same route associated with the dead is entered, endured, and ultimately exited by someone who knew where she was going. If initiates later treated the story as instruction, then the emphasis may have been less about worshipping a goddess and more about understanding what her journey represented. Passage through death without complete loss of awareness. That possibility would explain why knowledge becomes more valuable than obedience. The person who knows the route does not need to defeat the gatekeeper. They need to recognize the gate. The final threat in this theory has no face. It is amnesia. A human identity depends on continuity. Remove the body and one layer disappears. Remove the name and the social world loses its anchor. Remove personal history and relationships become inaccessible. Remove memory itself and even the reason to resist the process may vanish. Something could remain beneath all of those losses, but the terrifying possibility is that whatever remains might no longer know what happened to it. It therefore treats unconscious rebirth as the true prison. Rebirth alone is not enough to create captivity. The cycle becomes a trap when each return begins without the memory required to recognize that there was a previous return. A consciousness may pass through the same structure repeatedly and experience every arrival in physical life as completely new. This is why the ancient instructions surrounding death become so important to the theory. The dead are repeatedly told to remember names, recognize states, avoid confusion, preserve awareness, or understand the beings they encounter. Those teachings are not identical, and they cannot simply be collapsed into one religion. Yet they share an unusual concern with what the dying person knows at the exact moment ordinary identity becomes unstable. None of this establishes that Sumerian priests possess technical knowledge of a literal afterlife machine. The surviving material supports ancient beliefs about an underworld, divine authority, ritual passage, and the continuing existence of the dead. The engineered recycling system is a modern speculative synthesis built by connecting those elements with later traditions of rebirth and liberation. Even without accepting that synthesis as fact, one idea remains difficult to shake. Human beings usually imagine two possibilities after death. The self continues somewhere, or the self ends. The oldest descent stories leave room for a third possibility. Awareness may continue while the identity built during life does not remain intact. That possibility makes the seven gates frightening in a way fire and monsters never could. Inanna enters carrying the visible proof of who she is. By gate, that proof disappears. By the deepest point of the descent, almost nothing remains between the traveler and the laws of the realm she entered. For thousands of years, that sequence survived on clay. It may have been ritual poetry. It may have been a story about divine power, death, and return. The interpretation explored here asks whether it also preserved a warning. If consciousness survives the body, survival alone may not be enough. The real danger would be reaching the other side and no longer remembering that you were ever trying to escape. If a trap like that existed, it would not need to hide the door. It would only need to erase the reason you wanted to find it.